Hi, Oral Com 2. You have returned for the second part of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s biography. We're going to move on to my personal PowerPoint that I've shared with teachers across the internet. Hopefully, it will also be very informative for you. So, we just learned a little bit of an overview about Dr. King, probably things you already knew about him, like that he was a Baptist minister and that he was a civil rights activist, things like that, possibly even you knew he used nonviolent means of protest. But we start on my PowerPoint with a date and time that coincides with Rosa Parks's incident in which she would not give up her seat on the bus. I'm also going to share some personal stories with you today about my trip to Memphis, the Lorraine Motel, the location where Dr. King was assassinated. And Dr. King is joining us in the studio today, looking over our shoulder to make sure that we are doing well, right? So on my PowerPoint, you can see that in 1954 is when he began his ministry career at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is right around the time that Rosa Parks was arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus. We all know this story, right? She's very tired. She's seated on the bus. But when the bus fills up and white customers come on, she's supposed to give up her seat on the bus. The bus driver demands it. And when she refuses, she kind of holds firm to her beliefs. She's so exhausted that she herself didn't even believe that she had the power within herself to stand up to the white people on the bus. But she does. But as a result, she's arrested. Well, a women's coalition at that time, they were so frustrated with what had happened in Montgomery, they really used this as a catalyst to start a boycott in Montgomery. And the name of the organization was the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association. It was formed in the days just following Rosa Parks' arrest. Now, this organization, as you can see from the slideshow, really played a major role in fighting segregation in the city, but it was also cognizant of what was happening nationwide in terms of the Jim Crow laws. And the MIA produced some of the most famous civil rights leaders that we can recall, especially Dr. King. He was chosen to become a leader because he was so incredibly eloquent and he was so calm. Also, a lot of white people didn't know him at the time, and so that's why he was chosen as a leader. Now, the MIA, Montgomery Improvement Association, was based on some Christian principles of nonviolence and kindness towards your enemies. So why is that important? Because that's exactly what Dr. King believed in. He was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi, who was a nonviolent protester in India. Now, what I would like you to do is stop the video and then click on the link that says the Montgomery bus boycott so you can learn a little bit about this. But it was one of the most monumental events in the nation's history, and I'm going to try to break it down for you. So this women's group, they organized the boycott. And it was supposed to only last one day. And they were really hoping that about 50% of African Americans in the community would support this boycott and not ride the buses for a day, which would kind of stick it to the man, right? And say, hey, we don't abide by the segregation rules. And they were so surprised by the support of 99% of the African Americans in the community that they supported what they were doing. They did not ride the buses. Now, why was this important? Well, clearly, these were folks that needed rides to their jobs, and the only transportation they had were the buses. So they were really sticking it to the man when the bus companies were not able to make money. The city wasn't making money, but they felt so strongly about the injustice and the mistreatment of Blacks that they all supported it. Now, what did they want? They really had very modest demands for this bus boycott. Look at the PowerPoint and read this along with me. One, they felt like they should get some courteous treatment by the bus drivers. I mean, don't we all want that, right? You treat people like they're human. Also, they could ask for Blacks to be employed as bus drivers. Up to that point, they were excluded. And also, of course, with the seating, it should only be first come, first serve, and that would be the right thing to do. But the city ignored their demands, and they adopted this get tough policy on the demonstrators, and they harassed the protesters to the point in which there were some arrests made, which we'll get to in a moment. But the people in the city, they really needed transportation to get to their jobs. So some people became carpool drivers to allow people to drive in their cars and get to their jobs. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of those carpool drivers, but he was harassed and he was pulled over and he was arrested. He was ticketed on trumped up charges. But this did not stop them. They were still holding firm in their resolve. Well, the city was very angry, and many whites, especially those in the KKK at the time, were very angry. So white supremacists wanted revenge, and soon their actions became violent. 4 churches and the homes of Dr. King and other leaders of this boycott were targeted and bombed. I want you to stop the video now, and I would like you to watch this powerful YouTube video called Martin Luther King Jr. House Bombing, and you can see what happened and how Dr. King reacted and how things could have gone very differently. Okay, now that you've watched that video, you can see that Dr. King had a choice. How was he going to behave? His house was bombed. His wife could have been killed. His child could have been killed. He could have gotten so angry. I mean, wouldn't that be a natural feeling that we would all have, a feeling of resentment and anger and especially fear? But he asked people to remain calm, and that changed the entire situation. And despite those bombings and despite the harassment, the bus boycott continued. Well, people walked back and forth to work, or they rode their bikes, and the carpools were really helping the elderly get to their jobs. And the bus company was suffering the loss of thousands of dollars. But finally, on November 23rd, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the MIA, and segregated busing was declared unconstitutional. And the city officials reluctantly agreed to comply with that court ruling. And so you can see from my slide here that it shows people that are walking to work. But the bus boycott that was originally supposed to last one day lasted 381 days. And Dr. King was an essential part of the leadership to make that happen and keep people firm in their resolve. They did this through bad weather, through the heat, the cold, everything, and they were able to make it happen. So at that point, Dr. King had established himself as a national leader of the civil rights movement. Up until that point, he really wasn't well known, but his face began to be recognized by people. And he then continued to lead other boycotts or help to stage protests against segregation in the South. And you can see these jubilant pictures that are right after segregation ended in Montgomery. And there's a good quote for you. And you know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. What a great quote, right? What incredible, powerful language. We should all note that for oral communications. So to back up a little bit, we all understood from the bio about him that he was influenced by Gandhi, but obviously he was a pastor, so he's influenced by the Bible, but also Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, in which he is standing up against injustices. Here's another great quote. Love your enemies, King surely read many times in the book of Matthew. Bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. So now we know that despite his arrest, despite the house bombings, that this is what lay deep in his heart. Now, this was his platform of nonviolent protest. First of all, we can stick together. And when we stick together, we have strength in numbers. Secondly, our leaders don't have to sell out. You don't have to have mutually exclusive ideals. 3, threats and violence don't intimidate us. He said, you have to let go of the idea that you are afraid to die. We have to believe in ourselves, and economics is part of our struggle, because if we use the almighty dollar to protest and people are losing money, your voice is going to be heard, right? We have a powerful weapon, though, and that's nonviolent resistance. When they were riding the buses, this is a completely different story, but when they were trying to ride the Greyhound buses to the south and see how far they could travel south safely on the Greyhound buses, there were a lot of violent people that were hurting the blacks and the whites that were banding together to protest against racial inequality on the Greyhound buses. And but they knew that if they were very calm and they taught their people to be calm and just persevere, they knew that this could overpower those that were violent, and it worked. But of course, the following is that we, as Negroes, have arrived. We are no longer second-class citizens. So moving on. We all know about the sit-ins at the lunch counters, but this was another important big part of history where King's voice and his leadership became almighty and all important. So he helped to organize protests at these lunch counters. It was part of his nonviolent movement. I'd like you to stop the video to watch the National Museum of American History's Reflections on the Greensboro Lunch Counter. In this video, you're going to find out about how these men sat at the lunch counters and just asked simply for a cup of coffee, and they waited to be served. They were dressed very nicely. They were using the utmost care to use their manners. They were very, very polite. But we have all got a little bit of background knowledge on this, right? We know what happened to the people at the lunch counters. Sometimes they were just ignored, but in the worst case scenarios, people were violent against them and they would hurt those sitting at the counters waiting to be served. They could have ketchup poured on their heads, cigarettes put out in their hair, all kinds of terrible things. So in the video, there are two very important figures in the civil rights movement. You should know by now who Diane Nash is, and if you don't, you should get to know her. But also U.S. Representative John Lewis, who speaks about that time in history, right? So here's an image of the men at the lunch counter, and they're just dressed nicely, waiting to be served. But let's move on then to Birmingham. Why was there a protest in the first place in Birmingham? We've probably all heard Birmingham, the name of the city, but probably just as an exemplifier of one of the worst civil rights clashes that we've ever known. So the Birmingham campaign was a movement that was led in 1963 by the SLIC. We've talked about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it sought to bring some attention to the efforts by the local Black leaders. They wanted to desegregate public facilities in Birmingham. So what did that mean? That you wouldn't have whites only fountains, water fountains, and then blacks, or restrooms. There wouldn't be a segregation between whites and blacks. Blacks would be able to be in the waiting rooms of bus stations, simple things like that, right? It's also listing department store fitting rooms. Imagine going to get clothing, but you couldn't try the clothing on. So they wanted to desegregate. This movement in Birmingham was led primarily by Dr. King and also the Reverends James Bevel and Fred Shuttlesworth. So the March on Birmingham. In April of 1963, it was launched. They had these mass meetings. They had these lunch counter sit-ins. There was a march on City Hall. There was a boycott of the downtown merchants. And at this time, this was around Easter, so it was really hurting the downtown merchants. Now, Dr. King spoke to Birmingham's Black citizens about nonviolence and how to work it and his methods, and he appealed for volunteers. Well, he was shocked by how many people came out. When Birmingham's residents enthusiastically responded, the campaign's actions expanded to some kneel-ins at churches, sit-ins at libraries, and a march on the county. So they were surprised by how many children were a part of it too. So let's continue. When Birmingham's, the county courthouse to register votes. But on April 10th of 1963, the government obtained this unjust state court injunction that said there could be no protests. And that's ridiculous because as Americans, we all have the right to protest, to raise our voices. But after some debate, the leaders, King and others, decided that this court injunction against the protests was unjust and they were going to do it anyway. Oh boy. So skip ahead now to April 12th of 63. Dr. Martin Luther King, he leads a march on the street, but almost immediately he is jailed. And when he is jailed, he asks, can he simply make a phone call and call his wife, call anyone to help him? But he wasn't even given the right to a phone call. But Coretta Scott, his wife, called the White House, and she got in touch with Robert Kennedy, and John Kennedy, the president, phoned her back. He swore that he would look into it, so he sent the FBI to investigate what was going on in Birmingham. And this is when things were really starting to heat up. While Dr. King was in jail, he wrote a letter to religious leaders and other politicians, other leaders, and he pleaded to them to recognize the injustices of segregation. This letter was so wonderfully written. Those of you that are juniors or higher, like your juniors and seniors, you should have read in your classes, your English classes, the letter from Birmingham jail, which we don't cover in oral communications, but I would hope that you look further into that. So here is a picture of when Dr. King was jailed. See him on the left, his mug shot, and here he is behind bars. But even though he was arrested, the protests continued. And in May, they led a march that had many children. It was very symbolic because over 1,000 children were arrested. And again in May, more people gathered, but it became extremely violent. The pictures that I have here show how the police were using fire hoses and dogs to attack the young people. So over the next few days, these images of children and young people being attacked became widely known across the nation and even worldwide because it was televised internationally, and people all over the world were so upset. You can see I've written it was sparking international outrage. But these events, they helped to bring an understanding in other countries around the world about what America was dealing with in terms of its racial problems and the violence. And it forced President Kennedy to take action. In Birmingham, they took action too. They finally decided to desegregate the public facilities. But on May 11th of 1963, a bomb damaged the Gaston Motel where Dr. King and the Slick members were staying. The next day, the home of Dr. King's brother and Birmingham resident, Alfred Daniel King, was then bombed. And then 4 months later, this is a really bad one, and this is an image that I took in Memphis, that in September 15th, 1963, the Ku Klux Klan members bombed Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, which had been this staging center for many of the demonstrations. And unfortunately, 4 little girls were killed. We should all know their names: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. They were killed. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he delivered the eulogy at their funeral, September 18th, 1963. Despite these bombings, Birmingham was considered a success in the civil rights movement because they were able to get their demands met. Let's move on finally to when Dr. King speaks in Washington, D.C. at a march for jobs and freedom. He spoke to over 250,000 people that were there demonstrating and supporting this march. This was August 28th, 1963. Now, you have a document that provides you some fantastic information on what happened at this time, who the other speakers were, and I'd like you to stop the video and click on this link, which will take you to the background about the speech. Afterward, I would like you to click on the I Have a Dream speech YouTube video. Now, undeniably, the video is grainy considering how old it is. The audio is actually very good. So please stop the video now and do those 2 things. Okay, so now that you have read Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech and watched him and how powerful he was, the way he would raise his hands, the way he would use his voice up and down, um, now we can get to a really great thing that happened for him. On December 10th of 1965, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. In our background information, we found out that even though he won over $54,000, he gave the money toward civil rights, uh, the goal of civil rights improvement. But he was incredibly determined and he persevered despite all this pressure and numerous acts of violence against him over the years. Here are some examples. In 1956, remember, his house is bombed by segregationists in retaliation for the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1958, you didn't know about this before, Hotel Albert in Harlem was promoting his book, which was called Stride Toward Freedom, and he was stabbed by a deranged African American woman named Izola Ware Curry, who died recently in 2015. She was 98 years old. And we all know there were many threats and violence against him and his followers over the years. The image that I've chosen here shows that he has a bullet hole going through the glass of his house. During the Vietnam War, just so you understand where his philosophy was going, he was rethinking his mission to focus rather on from racial discrimination to problems about poverty, people that needed to be fed and people that needed to be clothed. And it caused issues with other civil rights leaders. Okay. And then this, one of these final slides, this is an image of James Earl Ray down here in the corner. April 4th, 1968, he was waiting to get picked up. He was going to go to dinner. It had been a rainy stay for him down in Memphis. He was at the Lorraine Motel. He was out here on the balcony and he was smoking a cigarette when suddenly from across the street, this man, James Earl Ray, was staying at a boarding house and he shot from a bathroom window of the boarding house and killed Dr. King right there on the spot. If you would like to pause the video at this point, you can click on the link to my personal album of photos, and it's also videos. I took a trip to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. It was very emotional. It's an incredibly solemn place. My daughter Lily and my husband Paul, as we were there, we didn't really speak much. We did a lot of reading, and we felt like it was a great experience for us all to understand. But this is an image of me, obviously right in front of the balcony where he was killed. And here is a shot looking out because they now have some glass where you can see he would have been standing right here where the wreath is. Okay, so after he was killed, the country, along with his wife, Coretta, and King's young daughter, Bernice, mourned his death. The entire country came together. And Dr. Martin Luther King is now entombed at the Freedom Hall complex. This site was listed as a National Historic Landmark May 5th, 1977. It was made into a National Historic Site on April 10th, 1980. We all know that we celebrate Dr. King's birthday, but some of us don't really understand why, and it might not be very relatable to you unless you know who he is, what he did for people. But President Reagan signed a bill to make January 20th the day that we celebrate his birthday as a national holiday. Now that you have read the speech, I Have a Dream, we will go through some of the figurative language, but that will be on a different video. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for learning about Dr. King with me, and signing off.